Slavery in Brazil began long before the first Portuguese settlement, founded in 1516, when members of one tribe enslaved captives captured as members of another. Later, colonists often captured expeditions called bandeiras. The importation of African slaves began in the mid-16th century, but the enslavement of peoples continued into the 17th and 18th centuries. During the Atlantic slave trade, Brazil received more African slaves than any other country. Approximately 5 million slaves from Africa were brought to Brazil between 1501 and 1866. Most of the enslaved Africans who arrived on the shores of Brazil were forced to disembark at Central African ports, especially Luanda. Slave labor was the driving force behind the growth of the sugar economy in Brazil, and sugar was the colony's main export from 1600 to 1650. Gold and diamond deposits were discovered in Brazil in 1690, leading to an increase in the import of African slaves for this new lucrative mining. Transportation systems were developed for mining infrastructure, and population growth increased due to immigrants seeking to participate in gold and diamond mining. The demand for African slaves did not diminish after the decline of the mining industry in the second half of the 18th century. Animal husbandry and food production spread following population growth, both of which relied heavily on slave labor. 2 million slaves were imported into Brazil from Africa between 1700 and 1800, and the rise of coffee production in the 1830s further stimulated the expansion of the slave trade. The problem of slavery existed in many countries. By the beginning of the 20th century, some states began to fight this phenomenon. The states of North and South America also joined this fight. However, slavery was not abolished then, just the import of slaves was prohibited. However, the business flourished domestically in America and Brazil. Prices for Africans skyrocketed, and slave owners made sure that the slaves they already owned would produce a lot of high-quality offspring. Slave owners encouraged relationships between slaves, and often themselves became fathers of slaves' children. Often the slaves were given an offer that they couldn't refuse. For example, she was promised freedom if she gave birth to 15 children. And on average, it was considered the norm that slaves began to give birth at the age of 13 to 14, and by the age of 20 they had already managed to give birth to 5 children. Slave owners bred slaves for specific physical characteristics that they believed made them more valuable as workers. For example, they bred slaves who were tall and strong for field work and those who were shorter and more agile for tasks such as housework. Men who met the criteria were locked in rooms with 6 to 7 women every day. This was their job and their daily norm. Some of them would get pregnant. The unfortunates were bred like cattle. The fate of an enslaved African American named Pata Seca is sad and tragic. He is known for having sired more than 200 children for his owner. The unfortunate one was purchased specifically to produce offspring for the benefit of his owner. Pata Seca was born in Angola in 1830, and he became a slave from childhood and, due to his prominent appearance, was doomed to a tragic fate at the will of an insatiable master. But this African American managed to go through a thorny path from a reproductive slave to an independent farmer with his own family. We tell the story of the legend of Brazilian history Pata Seca, a man who fathered more than 240 children. At the age of 12, he was purchased by a landowner at a slave market, who took the African American teenager as his slave. Roque had a powerful physique. His weight was 150 kilograms, and the young man was more than 2 meters tall. That is why the owner chose him to play the role of reproductor. Such slaves were also called inseminators and breeders. They were forced to have physical relations with various slaves in order to reproduce. But not at all for creating families between slaves, but for increasing the number of slaves in possession. After all, young and strong people are much more resilient than adult slaves who grow old and get sick. This practice was widespread among slave owners. The owner chose the strongest of his forced men to play the role of reproductor. It was also believed then that tall, strong men with thin calves were more likely to give birth to boys. Namely, they are needed for dirty and hard work on the farm. Roque passed the criterion perfectly in terms of external parameters. In addition, the man turned out to be extremely fertile. The number of women with whom Roque had intimate relations is unknown. However, according to some sources, he fathered more than 249 children. All of them inherited the status of slaves and were doomed to hard work on plantations or to be sold at auction. At the same time, Roque did not completely belong to himself. His health was carefully monitored. He was well fed. For a job well done as a reproducer, Roque received relatively favorable treatment from his master. In addition to his main job, he was tasked with caring for horses and delivering mail. Roque could drive unsupervised on the route from the farm to the city and back. Tried to escape and lost my name. The phrase pata seca translated from Portuguese means dry foot. That's what Roque was nicknamed. According to one version, Roque had dry and flaky skin on his legs. According to another, he could walk barefoot on the hot ground for hours without experiencing discomfort. There is a third version of why Roque began to be called pata seca. According to legend, Roque's feet were so dry that they left no traces on the ground after escaping. It was simply impossible to figure out where the slave went. However, his attempts to escape from his enslavers were still thwarted. His appearance was too noticeable. However, pata seca was popular among his own people. Roque had qualities that aroused the admiration of others: courage, intelligence, and charisma. He was deeply committed to the ideals of justice and human dignity. Therefore, he helped other slaves escape and create settlements for the survivors. These villages were called quilombos and became real strongholds of freedom for those who managed to escape the shackles of slavery. Even in the most difficult conditions, Roque retained faith in liberation and was ready to do desperate things to gain freedom. When we think of the horrors of slavery, we always think of Europe and the United States. But for 350 years, slavery was the mainstay of the economy of Brazil, then a colony of Portugal, which grew most heavily from the sale of slaves to Americans. About 40% of enslaved Africans bought in the United States were brought there from Brazil. Even when Portugal recognized the independence of Brazil in 1825, no one was going to abolish slavery there. And although in 1850 the Brazilian government finally abolished the international slave trade in the country, the demand for black labor still remained high. If enslaved women did not bear enough children to replace the old and dying slaves, the Brazilian economy would collapse. The entire slave society would collapse. Therefore, in order to maintain the slave population, enslaved Africans were forced to produce offspring. This slave breeding system operated like a factory. Enslaved Africans gave birth to even more children, who were eventually born into slaves. For this purpose, special breeding slaves were created, who were used for breeding, like livestock. The strongest, toughest, and tallest men were predominantly chosen as breeding slaves. Got his freedom after 40 years and got married. Thanks to his success as a reproductor, pata seca received relative privileges from his slave owner. When slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888, Roque received a piece of land as a gift. It turns out that he was a breeding slave for more than 40 years. On the donated land, Pata Seca founded the farm Sitio Pata Seca and started growing sugar cane, from which he made rapadura for sale. The earnings were modest, but enough to live on. But there was not enough money to collect funds. Roque failed to fence off his entire farm territory and part of it was seized by neighbors. Nevertheless, the man was able to realize the dream of a free life and took up farming, which brought him income and pleased his mind. Starting a family didn't take long either. While still working as a postman, Pata Seca met a girl named Palmira in the city. He married her. In their marriage they had 9 children. And with more than 240 children born into slavery, Pata Seca became the direct ancestor of approximately 30% of his city's population. The Roque family lived amicably and without need. Pata Seca was a respected figure among the locals. His 130th birthday was celebrated throughout the area and a parade was held in honor of the centenarian. 3 months after the Pata Seca celebration, he accidentally stepped on a nail. The resulting injury led to tetanus, which proved fatal. Pata Seca passed away on June 13, 1958. Having survived the abolition of slavery, the establishment of the Republic in Brazil and many other historical events, including 2 world wars. Thousands of people came to the funeral of the legendary Pata Seca to pay tribute to this amazing man who had come a long way from a slave to an independent farmer. And although Pata Seca's income was not excessively high, he had enough for a comfortable life. He used the money he earned to provide for his entire large family, caring for their well-being and making his dreams of a bright future come true. There are many legends about him. Some say that he lived 10 times longer than any slave. Others say that he was lucky because he did not experience all the horrors of slavery.